I am just delighted to be here today with Pastor Phil Eubank of Menlo Church in the Bay Area, California. And Pastor Eubank has been in ministry for 20 years, and this is my first time having an opportunity to meet him. So I'm really excited about today. And I had heard a series of messages that the church did back in I want to say, well, a few months ago about this idea of historic creationism. And so many of the messages seem to overlap with the things that we've been hearing from Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland and many of the other people that have been of interest in this little corner of the internet. So I wanted to hear from Pastor Phil and maybe have you tell your life story first, and then we can talk about the great story.
Sure, of course. Yeah. And I said this to you, Karen, before we were recording, but I want to let everybody know I will self-admittedly identify as the least intelligent person to ever be on this. So if you're thinking, should I skip today? I'm really smart. The answer might be yes. So we'll let that be my sales pitch for you to keep listening. So I grew up outside of Cleveland. This was where I kind of spent a lot of my upbringing years. Pretty unique kind of family of origin story, particularly for a pastor. Grew up with, I was the youngest of four, and I navigated abuse as a kid, primarily from my dad. And then my brother, when I was 8 and he was 16, ran away from home to escape that abuse for 15 years. We thought he died. And I eventually felt called to ministry, went to a Bible college, started seminary, and then my brother, turns out, was serving a lifetime sentence for international drug trafficking. And my dad prayed at that time, who was not a Christian. He prayed, "Hey, God, would you just let me know what happened to James before I die?" And then he gets out of the hospital and would never have been home. He was like super workaholic, traveling all the time, but was at home recovering. And my brother had gotten out on a technicality from prison, and after 15 years decided to call my house back in Ohio. And so we had this crazy reunion. It was amazing. I start ministry. Our family is sort of putting the pieces back together. Their relationship, it was amazing. It was a version of restoration and reconciliation where they had every reason to not want to know each other, and they just exhibited a ton of grace to each other. It's beautiful. And so, it was really special. Been in ministry.
Okay, slow down a little bit, because that was a big story that went by very fast. So I want to go back. So when you're 8 years old, your brother runs away from home because there's a lot of abuse in the home. Somehow between then and when you finish high school or somewhere in there, you heard the gospel, you became a Christian. When did all that happen? And
so I became a Christian.
And how were your parents involved in that or not involved in that?
Yeah, of course. So I became a Christian when I was 6. And that was really because of the influence of my mom. My mom was a first generation American Russian Jew, raised in Southern California by her Jewish parents, and then became a Christian like in her early 20s, and then sort of became the spiritual mentor of my life till she just passed away earlier this year, actually. And kind of through my childhood, that was always like my mom and church were like the safe places for me. All of us as siblings, as the youngest of 4, were welcome to go to church with her, but my siblings basically used my dad not going as an excuse to not go themselves. And I just felt pretty young, like, hey, there's something here for me. And then I felt called to ministry at 8 years old. And so, it's not lost on me that that's the same year my brother left. But that all sort of like rolled up to my brother leaving. And then in my teens, I did a bunch of different stuff, played football till I blew my knees out, and then started doing theater, and then started preaching regularly as a kid in services, which I was way too young and inexperienced to be given the opportunity to do, but that didn't stop them and it didn't stop me. And then went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago for undergrad. That's where I met my wife, Alyssa.
My oldest daughter went there too.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so I've visited many times and greatly enjoyed Founders Week there.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, really special, super special place. I had grown up in all public schools, and so it was really fun for me. Like, I just never experienced Christian education. So there were lots of folks that have different experiences at a Christian school, and it's not perfect, but for me, I think it was just really, really transformative to be in a community that you had sort of a common framework of the way you thought about the world, and even just the way you could incorporate practices like worship and prayer and Bible study way more regularly than was easy to do when I was younger. So,
well, one of the ironic things is here you're sitting with a beard, and when my daughter was there, my older daughter,
couldn't have it.
Yeah, was there in the late 80s.
Yeah.
And at that time, the guys couldn't have beards or sideburns or hair below their collar, or
most of that was still
girls. Most of that was, had to follow certain. They couldn't go to movies.
Most of that was still in place when I was there. You could go to movie. There was like weird legalistic things about it, like you could go to a movie if you stayed at someone else's house that night or something. It was a silly, like we're talking about fundamentalist Christianity from 100 years ago, still sort of showing up in.
So how did you deal with that? When you were there, did it feel okay? And then since then you've changed, or when you were there, did you chafe at that a little bit? And what do you think about that now theologically?
Yeah, I mean, I never really, for me, I never saw it as like this is what's being advocated for my life. I always viewed it through the lens of Moody was a special place and I was in it for a set period of time. And if folks don't know this, it's a school that's right in the heart of Chicago. It's really built for you to go into ministry. And D.L. Moody, who founded it, like kind of one of his core convictions was, I want people to be able to go into ministry that feel called to it without money being a factor. And for me, like I didn't want to go to a private Christian liberal arts school, amass a ton of debt, and stop doing ministry. I'd been doing ministry since I was a kid, and like random suburban area, disconnected campus that feels like it's in the middle of nowhere. It was going to be way more difficult to do that. And so it allowed me to continue to do ministry. And a really unique wrinkle of Moody is that donors from around the world pay your tuition. So when I was there, for every one of us that was at the school going, there were 7 people that they would have said yes to if they had money and space, and they didn't. And so there was this sort of responsibility that you felt, this stewardship that you felt to say, hey, there's other people that would love my spot. I'm here and I have a responsibility to the investment that's being made in me. So yeah, I mean, there are times that the rules are annoying for sure. But I also think that they were really there. I think that it was like the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. The letter of the law got out of hand at times and it felt unnecessary and overbearing. But I think the spirit of the law was like, how do we help students focus? And so it did for me. It was really helpful. I had and have a learning disability, a reading disability, and severe dyslexia. And so, school for me in high school was really hard. It just took a ton out of me to be successful and effective in an education environment. And so I think it was super, super helpful that those distractions weren't there for me. I know for other students, that's different. Their story about it is different, but that's the way I chose to see it.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that up that way, because in general, when people talk about, a lot of the celebrity atheists that talk about God, they always want to talk about, how he's so cruel or so restrictive, or, if there is a God, he's this way and everything. And I think every single one of those things boils down to you're looking through the wrong lens, because if you look through the lens of love and purpose,
right,
and every single one of those stories makes a completely different sense. So
yeah, well, and I think I used a quote from Tim Keller 2 weeks ago, maybe. That's pastor in New York City, passed away recently, really kind of a legend. And he makes the statement: as Christians, we often want to look at the Bible and see what we feel like we need to reject, or what we want to disagree with. But really the better set of lenses is to read the Bible and say, hey, what are some things that I need to reject in me? What are some things that need to change about me? And I think it's fundamentally, if I worship a God that I never disagree with, I'm not really worshiping any other God but myself. And I think those are hard mirrors to look at. We don't want that. We want a God that submits to us because we live in a culture that says that's the standard. But I don't think it's healthy. I also don't think it's true. And so I get to choose to submit to a God that I believe is real and true and authoritative, or not. And we all get the same choice.
So you became a Christian when you were 6, and through all the years of training and everything, and then going into ministry and doing ministry, have you ever hit a patch where you felt yourself like deconstructing, going into some doubt, or is there anything about your personal experience that can help you understand all the people that are deconstructing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think on some level, I think that I did ministry after grad school. I did ministry in Seattle for 8 years, and then a very unchurched community in Colorado for 7 years, and then now in the Bay Area. So I think my context has always been sort of the ceiling. The best possible scenario is the religiously skeptical. That's like we're winning with them. And a lot of times it's people who either are not considering faith at all, or people who have deconstructed a kind of childhood faith. And I think for me personally, there were certainly times, you grew up in an abusive home, and there are times that you're going, God, how could you do this? How could you let this happen? And there's just no honest person, I think, that's going to go through something like that and not regularly reevaluate, hey, is this the God that I really believe in? Is this the truth that I'm really going to hold to? For me personally, for whatever reason, I think it's just grace. I've never wrestled with, does this mean that God isn't real? I know that for some people that's a very genuine struggle, and I want to be sensitive to that. I think for me, it was a little bit more, I think it was just a little bit more, God, how could you and how would you use it, rather than do you exist at all? I did struggle a little bit. I think in undergrad, no one had ever really talked to me about soteriology. And so if you're unfamiliar, that's kind of the theological category of how God saves people. And there are two main camps in that. One is called Arminianism, which is really centered on free will. And one is Reformed theology, or Calvinism. And that centers more on God's sovereignty. And I think an honest theologian will tell you that there's a tension in the scriptures between those things. But I had really grown up without knowing any of the categories and kind of just living into a more Arminian view. And then in Bible college, I was just exposed to a lot more of the scriptures, and I was studying books like Romans very intently and deeply. And I had kind of a crisis of faith of, not does God exist like this, but can I love a God like this? If Reformed theology is actually something that I feel like is true and best represented in the scriptures, which I do, what does that mean for me? And so that was probably the closest for me of kind of a crisis of faith of, as my core theology is changing, what does it look like for me to pursue a God that I'm realizing that I had big gaps in the middle of. So, and I think if we're honest, most of what we call deconstruction today for the history of church was called spiritual formation or discipleship. And I think that we just live in a day where how we are is more and more being shaped to answer the question of who you are. And what idolatry was in the Old Testament was statues. Now idolatry is identity. And so I'm trying to grab a group. I'm trying to grab an identity group. And so like this kind of spiritual deconstructing, progressive Christian, this label in my cultural moment, I think can sometimes make us feel safe. Oh, I found a label, I found a community, and now I'm done. Well, we're never done. God's still working on us. And so I think the best thing we can do, if you're experiencing that, or the best thing you can do if you know someone that you care about who's experiencing that, is just don't give up on the relationship. Continue to be there through the ups and the downs, continue to journey with them, because a year from now, it's going to be different. And 5 years from now, it's going to be different. And as long as God gives you the chance to have breath in your lungs and a relationship with them, continue to walk with them. And if that's you, continue to walk with people who care about you, continue to walk with people who maybe you don't see the same thing theologically that they do anymore. But even though our culture says surround yourself only with people who agree with you, I would say buck that trend. Be somebody that continues to relate to people who don't see eye to eye on everything.
Yeah, I think there's this whole tendency in our modern era, and I don't exactly know how that happened, that time has taken on a different perspective,
Hmm.
because there was a time when people could take the long view. Actually, I guess it has to do with technology, because when you can't, you have to take the long view when you plant a crop and it's not going to come to harvest for 3 or 4 months, or when you plant a garden and it's not going to come to its full beauty for many years. But we tend to think that every problem has to be solved right now. Every experience has to be taken care of right now. And to get the idea that God is not working on the right now, he's working on the whole picture all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that we are, I just think that we struggle, I think, through a sense of kind of cultural pride sometimes. Sometimes it gets called recency bias or just historic hubris, that we assume we are the smartest, most evolved version of humanity that has ever existed. And spoiler alert, every version of humanity has thought that, but it has not been true of every version of humanity. And so I think a level of introspection to say, not everything that's in the cultural water, that's in sort of the social stew of 2023, is altruistically positive. Not all of it is up and to the right. And if I can understand that, because I think we think, well, will I serve the God in the Bible? Will I believe the God of the Bible, or will I reject the God? That's actually not the choice. The choice is, will I be formed by the gods of the present age, or will I be formed by the God of all ages? And I mean, obviously, I'm a pastor saying that, so of course I believe that. But I do think this idea that, well, it's, Phil, don't you realize what year it is? How could you possibly believe that? I might suggest that there are times throughout human history I could go back to, and people would be very confident of their worldviews and positions because of the year it was. And it turns out they were very, very incorrect.
Well, so let's get on to this thing of this idea of the great story. When you did the series of messages about historic creationism, first of all, why did you decide to have the church go through that series? And then I guess one of my curiosities is, because many of the teaching pastors took part in that series, was that something that you laid out ahead of time with everybody and you sort of all agreed on what direction you were going to go, or did each pastor take a section and then just come up with their own perspective on it? Or how did that work? Because it was really so all beautifully woven together.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think to a certain extent, every church is a little bit different about this. We have a unique model where our teaching team teaches at one location, and then that location gets broadcast to other locations. So I know that, like, as people think about church, that may not be the mental map that they have for what we're talking about, but that's the way it works at Menlo. And because of that, I think we try to work really hard to set up all of the campuses of Menlo to be successful and have the very best conversation. So we map out our teachings typically 8 to 12 months ahead. And so we're working usually with a team of 8 to 10 people from our team, and we're asking big questions like, hey, what should we be talking about over the course of this year? In church history, there was a liturgical church calendar. And in that liturgical church calendar, you would say, hey, it's fall. This is what we teach in the fall. Hey, that's getting near Christmas. Here's what we do at Advent. We're getting to Easter. Here's what we do during Lent. Like, those are all kind of church calendar things. So we don't necessarily follow those exactly to the T, although we do to a certain extent. We're pretty serious about Lent around here, and we do a lot around Advent. But there are also, I would say, kind of a modern liturgy. So as you're building that in the summertime, one of the things we try to think through is we just know that a lot of people are going to be inconsistent in their attendance. And so we want to do something that has kind of staying power that people can go watch later and still has relevance. We also want to teach something that if you miss a week or two and then you come back, it doesn't feel like you've missed the thread of the whole series. And usually those series are longer. And so, so we did a series called The Rest of the Story. And the core principle was basically, what does it look like for me to graduate beyond childlike faith? I want to grow in my faith so that I grow up with it rather than grow out of it. And that means that some of the ways we learn, we talked about flannel graph faith, right? If you grew up in church, you may remember the flannel graph stories of the way you learned passages from the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures. And that was great. That's exactly how we should have learned about it at the time. But nobody went back later and was like, hey, there are some like really big implications of this. And you don't have to understand this exclusively through the lens of a 4-year-old learning it in Sunday school. And if you don't say that, I think what it can feel like is, well, if I ever see it differently than this, then I guess I don't get to believe. And really helping people to understand that if you walked away from your faith for anything other than the person and work of Jesus, you may have walked away unnecessarily, because while the Bible is the authority of our faith, it is not the foundation. The resurrection of Jesus is the foundation of the Christian faith. It has been for 2,000 years. And so, we looked at what are some of the major kind of conversations where this shows up. And certainly one of the leading conversations is the way we think about the origins of the world. And so, it gets pitted as, are you just that closed-minded bigot that believes that God did this in 6 days, took a day to rest, that the earth is 4,000 years old? Or are you a smart person? And of course, you think about evolution and the Big Bang and all that stuff, and helping people to understand, first of all, there's a way bigger spectrum than just those two reductionistic viewpoints. And there's followers of Jesus, like faithful followers of Jesus, that hold to different views on this conversation. This is an area where we can find unity while not having to strive for uniformity.
And so did you have a particular lens through which you developed this? Did you have, I think you mentioned before we got on the air that there was a particular book that talks about this topic of historic creationism. And
yeah. So, one of the ways that I would say I just like think about teaching in general is I really want to, more than telling people what to think, I want to teach people how to think. And so I'll tell you what I think and what I believe and what my position on a particular subject is. But especially if it's one of these areas where we kind of have closed-handed stuff, this is non-negotiable, and open-handed stuff, where it's open-handed stuff, man, I want you to be able to pursue what you believe. And so there's a couple resources. One actually is a series of books called The 4 Views. They look like that right there. So this is a helpful book. It's not just available for this particular conversation. You can find it for lots of different stuff. But again, it just, I think, helps break down the polarities. And the people that write in it are writing essays, and they're the leaders in all the views. So they're not, it's just not one author trying to straw man 3 views and then tell you why they think it's like, this is the best view. And then they respond to one another's essays. And so we'll give some critical feedback. And then the book
could we for the people who are listening on podcast and not viewing the YouTube, let's give the title and the authors.
Yeah. So this book's called 4 Views, which is the series called the 4 Views series. 4 Views on Creation, Evolution, and Intelligent Design. And the contributors are Ken Ham, Hugh Ross, Deborah Harsman, and Stephen Meyer are the 4 authors there. So that one's really helpful. And then a book that I referenced as well is a book called Genesis Unbound by John Sailhamer. And I referenced a more recent view on creationism called historic creationism, that he has really been the leading voice in the conversation, big Old Testament theologian guy. And so I think, just it offers one more thing to think about as it relates to how do I take the scripture seriously? How do I reconcile that with scientific discovery? I don't want to say no to either one of those things, and I don't think you have to as a Christian. I think that science oftentimes can be how God does something. The scripture can often say what he did. And I think I had a friend teaching just recently. He said, science is God showing his work. And I think, I think that's entirely possible for all of us, no matter our line of work, no matter our expertise. I think the Bible can hold up. And I think we have to be careful not to pit it against scholarship or scientific discovery.
Yeah, some people say, well, one of the things I like about what Jordan Peterson says is that when people ask him, is the Bible true? He says, the Bible is truer than true because it's what is always true.
Yeah.
Because every time you read a story in the Bible, if you read it carefully, you can see that it's like this fractal thing that comes out into all of history and into your daily life. And
Well, and I did a talk just a couple weeks ago called "Is the Bible Reliable?" as a part of our series Explore God. And I think, a lot of times we bring a level of skepticism to the Bible, whether we grew up in church or not, because our view of the Bible is overly simplistic, right? It's either, a book of fairy tales written by a homophobic, bigoted, warmongering God, or it's a magic spell book. And like, I think understanding that the Bible is not a book, actually, it's a library of 66 books written by dozens of people over the course of thousands of years. And to be able to understand that in the midst of that are different genres. You have historic narrative, you have poetry, you have apocalyptic literature, you have letters, all those things. I think when we understand, okay, just like any other book that I would be showing up to and going, how am I supposed to read? You read a nonfiction book different than you read a scientific textbook. You read a book of poetry different than you would read a newspaper describing the events of the day. And the Bible really does have all of those genres. And when we understand it, I think we can understand it in a context where we go, okay, I understand not everything that the Bible describes is even God prescribing it that way. Sometimes it's God describing the way that things were in a broken world in times of deep atrocities. And we bring 21st century lenses to it. And we say, well, why would God do it this way? Well, part of it is it wasn't functioning in a 21st century Western democracy. And so I just think that, again, we have to constantly check ourselves against our own sort of recency bias that we bring to it.
well, so one of the things that is curious to me is that you said you're 40 years old.
That's right. Recently. Yeah.
Recently. Yeah. Just recently 40 years old. So that's a big hump to get over.
Yep.
Um, and you've been brought into a very, well, and this may be my Bay Area bias, but I think this is a difficult environment. And then you've come into a sprawling church with many campuses and been given this huge responsibility. And why do you think you were the one that was chosen? Because I know that the search committee looked for 2 years to find somebody to come here.
They got desperate. That's why I'm here. Yeah, I don't know. To be honest, I think some of that is probably providential. Like I won't know till the other side of eternity. I think that the conversation with the team that was doing the search at Menlo, I was pretty upfront. Like I wasn't looking to go anywhere. We loved our church, had great community, good relationships. The firm that was, and if you're not a church person and you're listening to this or watching this, this is all going to sound weird. So I apologize. But there was a search firm that was kind of helping Menlo find who was next. The president of that search firm cold called me and said, hey, would you have a conversation? And I was like, oh, I think you have the wrong phone number. This can't possibly be for me. And I think it was a discovery process where, because I thought someday they would just pick up the phone and be like, oh, like we realized you're not a big deal at all. And we are, so we're going to move on. And I would have been like, totally get it. But I think because of that, I was able to be very honest about who I was, how I lead, and then just talk about, okay, this probably isn't going to be me, it's somebody else. But if I was at Menlo, this is what I do. And I just kind of gave it away. I just told them what I would do. And I think it allowed us to be really honest and clear with each other, and then give God a chance in the meantime to, some of it is what can you do? Like, what are your core competencies? But I think some of it's just cultural fit. Like, do you like this group of people? Do they like you? Do you want to live life and do ministry together? And so over the course of 5 or 6 months, I think there was just a tremendous level of affection for one another, a great level of alignment about the way we saw the future. And then on our side, just a bunch of sort of external circumstances that were confirming that it was the path that God was taking us on. So I think that the heart of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, high tech, intellectually honest, rigorous pursuit of Orthodox faith, like those were all things that I've been passionate about my whole life. And so to a certain extent now, 10 months in, even with challenges and hard things to deal with, there's no doubt in my mind that God used the last 40 years to prepare me for the next season here at Menlo.
And you have a wife and 4 children, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So my wife.
And how has it been for them to adjust to this new environment?
Good. I mean, this fall, we've been here since January, and this fall has definitely felt the most normal. We had the kids stay home, and we did like homeschooling, which we'd never done before, in the spring to help in the transition. And then in the fall, 3 of the 4 kind of went back to more traditional school environments. And our oldest loved homeschool. He's really high functioning, brilliant, but he's on the spectrum. And I think he always wrestled with kids at school that were just middle school kids doing things that middle school kids do. He has such a high justice barometer. That was really hard for him. And then I think that honestly, it was just going too slow for him. So he's doing great and finding community here. The rest of them are doing the same. So this fall, I think has helped find a sweet spot for them.
Really glad to hear that, because I can imagine, I mean, it's a huge adjustment. I mean, if nothing else, just the sticker shock of everything that around here is just so much more expensive. Gasoline.
It is. Well, we drive 2 electric cars. That helps. But
Okay.
but I do think, yeah, when you talk to people that don't live around, especially if I talk to friends in the Midwest, but even Colorado, I'm like, just double or triple the cost of everything. That's what it all costs here. So
Yeah.
that is definitely something to get used to. And you just kind of go, hey, we're going to make different choices and different decisions as a family. And if we feel called to live here and do ministry here, there's lots of places that God could have called us to, and they all bring challenges. And so this is just one of those challenges here.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, so what books are you reading lately?
It's a great question. So I finished for a series very recently, a book called How Not to Read the Bible by Dan Kimball. It's a really helpful book that we were kind of I was working through as a part of the prep content for Explore God that we just finished. That was extremely helpful. And it's just all the ways that we kind of all the stereotypes that we have about the Bible and how we can, I think, with integrity, read the Bible and understand them. I'm about done with a book called The Great De-Churching, written by some researchers that are looking at the overall trends in America to see why we're watching such a precipitous decline, basically from 1935 to about 2000. Let's call it 70% of Americans would identify as Christian and go to church. That number in the last 20 years has dropped at least 25%. And that, like, we've just never seen anything like that in American history. And so what are the reasons for that? Like, I bring assumptions to it. But I think they've done some good work to identify what are some of the leading causes for that. And then from a pastoral perspective, how can churches best position themselves to care for their communities in that new world? And then I did a couple books. Most recently finished a book called The Reappearing Church by Mark Sayers that was really helpful. And then there's a book, not a Christian book, just a book, but a book called The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener. And it's about,
he's wonderful.
It's about how we sort of, whether we realize it or not, like the influence of Christianity over the last 2000 years, it's everywhere. Like so much that we take for granted. It's like woven into our reality. So those are some that have been more recent.
Yeah, Glenn is fantastic. He's been on here before and we had a terrific conversation, but he also has written a couple of wonderful, I guess you'd call them devotionals, little something for each day from a passage of scripture. And he starts at the book of Genesis and just goes through, and he has a wonderful perspective on things.
That's great. One of the other books I'll mention too that I just found to be extremely helpful this year is the book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Yes.
Again, not a Christian book. Actually, the authors are kind of like center and political left in their political leanings. But they're just identifying, I think, in a very intellectually honest way. They did an article in The Atlantic that kind of took off. And then they're trying to identify what are some of the fault lines that we're feeling in culture right now. Why are we feeling them the way that we are? And like, where are we seeing the kind of fray at the edges? And at least for me, it gave language to some of what I was feeling, especially on the other side of COVID.
One of the things that I've always appreciated about Menlo is that no matter what happens with the political culture wars, Menlo has sort of woven a path to not fall into either side.
For sure.
And I noticed that you have carried on that tradition as well.
Hey, I'm very
Is
passionate
that the
about.
way you have always been in your ministry?
Yeah. They got me in trouble during COVID, right? Because I would say, hey, as followers of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, we should view our entire life, including and especially our politics, through the lens of our faith, not the other way around. And we get in trouble when we take our national identity or we take our political identity, and that becomes the guiding framework of our life. And now I'm reinterpreting my faith. I'm reinterpreting the Bible. I'm reinterpreting Jesus. And I'm saying the thing that's unshakable about me has to be my political ideologies. No. Our theology should shape all of our ideologies. And so, yeah, that's been a passion point for me. And then I think in Menlo, you're right. There has been this really rich history of making sure people know at Menlo, we have people that are left, right, and center politically that, no political party in America has the moral high ground as it relates to scriptural understandings of things, right? We can go, hey, what does it look like to dive into a nuanced and thoughtful conversation around life with the conversation of, on one side, kind of this polarity between the dignity of those in poverty and on the other side, the rights of the unborn. You have that spectrum basically about every subject. And so when we say, well, Jesus would have voted, Jesus would have done, I just think we should be far more humble in the way that we understand that, and understanding that, like, my personal faith should be the thing informing how I vote. I think you should vote. But I think it's way more complex than two political parties want to make it seem.
And so you mentioned that your theology should inform your life rather than your ideology. And on this, on the topic of theology, one of the things that I have talked with a lot of people about on this channel is there seems to be a hunger amongst many of the young people coming into the church, because there are young people coming into the church. And particularly, I think there's a large group of young men who have become interested in Christ and become interested in becoming a part of a church. But they're very hungry for some kind of liturgy. And one of the things that I noticed that we sort of don't have at Menlo and have never really had is a kind of liturgical approach to the worship service. Is that anything that you ever think about? Like having a reading and response, or maybe having more in the terms of reading scriptures in the service, or
I think those are always things that, for when we kind of think about like a ministry tool belt, right? I would argue that every experience you have, the moment you do it once, it's liturgy, right? Like, we have a liturgy at Menlo. Our liturgy is often 2 or 3 songs, announcements, a message, and a song. That's our liturgy. It may at times include reciting the Lord's Prayer. It may at times include reading scripture. But I think it's not, we're viewing it through the lens of, like, what makes the most sense in this service at this time. One of the things that we do at Menlo that I think is pretty unique is that we will often associate a spiritual practice to a particular series. And so, we did a whole series this fall called Teach Us How to Pray, where we were following the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray. And then we were modeling, what does it look like to understand that as a liturgical framework for personal prayer? And so I even gave time in services of silence for people to be able to do that. I would argue that's sort of a form of modern liturgy. And I think that there are times where that's like a really easy thing to tie from one thing to another. And then we'll do one in Christmas time, really around scripture reading. Like, what does it mean if you're not regularly reading the scriptures outside of services? What does it mean to give people handles that help them navigate that well? We're about to go into a series celebrating 150 years as a church, and we're going to talk about the spiritual practice of celebration. We're going to do some of that together, and we're going to hopefully help people do that on their own. And so I think historically, the church has done a very good job doing things like that in a service, but not as strong helping people integrate it into their life. And my hope is that we can introduce people to those things in services, but really help them move the needle in experiencing some of that in their everyday life.
And recently you did a series called Explore God, in which many of the churches in the Bay Area were gathering together to do the same kind of series. So how did that get started? I think you said
Yes.
160 churches in the Bay Area were following the same
Yeah. So it's
suggestion.
actually, I don't know the name of the organization that came up with it. I think it's in Texas. We didn't use their sermons. Like they had it as dialed in as like, here's manuscript if you want to just preach that manuscript. But we took the high level questions and then we made those per week and then built our own curriculum for discussion groups, whether they were existing groups that took it on or all of our campuses really had Explore God discussion groups that started up for people that wanted to just have a conversation in the midst of it if they weren't a part of a group or if they were spiritually seeking. And that was awesome. I mean, we had tons of people at campuses that choose to experience those. And then locally, there's an organization called TBC, Transforming the Bay for Christ. And that organization was really kind of the rallying point to try to bring all of these churches together and say, hey, what if we all did this as one, right? There's a few places in America that have never had a documented revival, what we would consider like a big move of God where a bunch of people meet Jesus and it starts to meaningfully change the culture. And one of those places is the Bay Area. And so I think we're just praying, God, would you do something like that here? You know, we want to be faithful and see it, and we certainly need it. Mental health crisis is as bad as it's ever been. What it looks like for people trying to navigate income inequality, socioeconomic divides, pressure, stress, anxiety. We need the hope of heaven in the hurts of this moment, I think maybe more than ever. And so hopefully the series moves the needle.
And did you get together with these other pastors from the other churches to have meetings or prayer times or anything in preparation for this? Or
so there were some gathering points for like worship and prayer before that were hosted at different churches. And then pastors that it'd be tough to get together with 160 speakers and come up with a message together. But pastors that I'm connected to, we stayed in touch kind of leading up to and through the series together.
Yeah, I thought it was a terrific idea. It was a terrific series. I learned a lot. And I always, people ask me, why are you in a Protestant church? And I always say, well, I mean, the church that I'm at is just great, especially in terms of the teaching and the focus on community, because community is like so important for people to have a place to put down roots. And do you want to talk a little bit about your approach to community?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a line, it's kind of a tired ministry line, but circles are better than rows. And when we think about church, we often think about rows. They're helpful. They're a great entry point for a lot of people. Now there's kind of a second set of rows, right? And that's the row of people watching online. Nobody comes to a church that they haven't experienced an online service of if they have one to watch first. But at some point you go, hey, I want to maybe process this beyond just this experience. I want this to be more integrated into my life. And so at Menlo, we have what we call life groups. And those life groups meet throughout the week. They meet in people's homes. Some of them are going to cover the content from the weekend, and they're going to try to go a little deeper and implement that into their life. Some of them are a little bit more life season and stage oriented. And so they're looking at things that maybe are really relevant to them as a young family or as empty nesters or whatever that is. But they are groups that are going to be people that kind of become your people. And we always want to be making room so that the next group of people that are ready to find their people can do it at Menlo, because a service or preaching or music may get somebody through the door. It's not going to keep them here, because people don't stay at churches for music or messages. They stay at churches because it's their church, not because it's a program they attend. And so I think it's the place where we see meaningful life change. I hear people say lots of great stuff about cool weekend services and what God did to them in those moments and how special that is. But the real life change, when you listen to most of those stories, is what happened next. The person that God tied them up with, the group that they got connected to. And I think at Menlo, life groups allow us a great vehicle to be able to see that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been very special for us. We've been part of a life group for about 4 years that meets at our home. And it's been great to not only have the meetings, but become friends with each other, do social activities together, do ministry things together. And it becomes an extension of family. And I just feel like it's so important for everybody to have that experience.
Totally agree. And I think, what churches used to do, like we did this. This is not a new thing in church world. Like we have a name for it, but lots of churches have it. I think what is so unique now is that just the idea of being in a room with people you don't know very well,
Yes.
committing to be in relationship with them, maybe sharing a meal and continuing to show up, that is miraculous in 2023. Like if you're not a church person, I just think you want that, you need that, and you don't know how to get that. And so I think more and more that distinctive of community around a mission that a church has, I think is going to become more and more unique and attractive in a culture that has less and less of it.
Well, the other unique thing about life groups is, particularly our life group, because the way we got together was that we went through the starting point class.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
And happened to be at the same table.
Yeah.
People we would have never met under any other circumstance, and they weren't and aren't. We have very little in common outside of our being together in this group, and yet to learn to do life together with people of such diverse opinions and ideas, and that to me is one of the great miracles of the whole thing. And it reminds me, maybe 10 years ago, my husband and I got involved in square dancing. And we only did it for about 5 years, and then his job just got too intrusive. We didn't have time to get there. But when you go to square dancing, you meet all these people you'd never meet under any other circumstance in the world. And then you have to hold hands together.
Yeah.
And you're holding hands and dancing. And that's a little bit what like a life group is. It's putting yourself in a situation you'd never be in otherwise, and then reaching out and touching somebody else. And yeah, so one of the things I'm really thankful for.
Yeah. Yeah.
And are there any ideas that you're contemplating right now that aren't leading to another series, but just things that you think about for your own personal contemplation and intellectual interest or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I spend a lot of time these days kind of pondering what does the next election do to America? What does the next election do to the church?
Yeah.
You know, the last time, 2016, I think caught most people by surprise. Even if you were voting Republican, when all the primaries started to election night, it was pretty wild to watch what took place. And I think there's the secondary impact of just the way we treated each other, the way that misinformation and disinformation on both sides of the political spectrum became normative. And then we watched that continue into 2020, exacerbated by a pandemic. I don't think that those divides have gone away. And I think that churches are hopefully better and better prepared to have meaningful conversations about it. I try to sort of sprinkle in little subtweets about it all the time. I try to say things like, hey, like we have people that are not just Republicans or not just Democrats in this church. That's a good thing. I'm glad that's the case. And if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you do not have the moral high ground. Like that is not true. These subjects are way bigger than a political world can solve for them. But I think a significant part of the acceleration of the de-churching of America, I think, is when it was really so many of the trends accelerated because of the political divide and the level of disenfranchisement that existed in our culture. And I'm just curious to see kind of what happens next with that, and try to hopefully be a voice of hope and a voice of reason and a voice of conversation in a time and a place regionally where I think it would be so easy to just pile on and be another voice of vilification and anger. These conversations matter, like who we vote for matters. It really does. But if we communicate this in a way that I believe more, and I'm more passionate about who I'm voting for, than if you're a person of faith, what you understand to be God's role in your life, I would say you may, you may be revealing that your politics are more than just a thing that you believe. It actually may be an idol in your life.
And are there any thinkers that you're following that are helping you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple podcasts that I really like. There's a podcast called The Bulletin by Christianity Today that I think does a good job of wading into these issues it's a Christian podcast, but in a little bit more intellectually honest way than I think we would sometimes otherwise assume. I always love when Malcolm Gladwell talks about this stuff, because I think he brings such a refined perspective to make sure we're taking things into historic context and not overreact. There's a book that I really liked a couple years ago called Live No Lies by John Mark Comer, that I think from a faith perspective nibbles at the edges of why some of where we are is where we are. And then that book I mentioned earlier, The Coddling of the American Mind, I think speaks to the extremes of this as well to a certain degree. But yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see it and hear it more and more again. And then you add into that sort of the innovation of AI and the level of fake content that will sound true. And this isn't, no one side politically is going to have the upper hand. I think we're going to see it get used maliciously by sort of both sides, by any group of the extremes. And so if we weren't doing very well decoding fact from fiction before that existed, I have concerns about how we're going to navigate it after.
So one last question I have for you, I guess, and because I know your time is limited. When you hear the word reality, what do you think of?
I mean, I think of reality is the present circumstances, of our world, in the tension between what God permits in brokenness and what I would call sin, rebellion, the fracturing of the created order because of that capacity, and the ongoing work of God and the church to see his kingdom come, his will be done on earth in this moment as it is in heaven. So I think reality is not just that kingdom, and it's not just this kingdom. It's living in the tension of both.
Interesting. I like
How'd
that.
I do?
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And it was fun getting to know you a little bit better. It's going to certainly flesh out a lot of the messages that I sit under you on Sunday mornings. So
no, I really appreciate it. It's great. And like I said, honored to be asked. And yeah, if any of those books are helpful, I also, because I'm dyslexic, most of these books, if you're ever like, oh man, does he really read that many books? Some people do. Before I read a book, if I really like it, I've already listened to it. Like I listen to books all the time. It helps me process. I'm an auditory learner anyway. And then with dyslexia, it's just been a really easy coping tool for me to make sure that I'm continuing to process. So all those ones that I've referenced are available online as well.
Well, so talking about the listening and the reading, are your messages by any chance in transcript any place online that people can access them?
They are, yeah. If you go to menlo.church and then you click on whatever series you want to look at, there'll be a thing that says like watch the message, and then or there'll be a big play button to watch the message. There'll be a small button that says study guide, and that's like what we make for life groups that are going to study it for that week. And then next to that, you'll see transcript. And so if you click that,
that is really good to know, because there's a lot of times I'd like to go back over one of your messages, but I don't have time to sit through the whole thing. And I'd like to just go back and pick out parts.
I mean, you don't listen to my message 3 or 4 times a week? That is heartbreaking. Yeah, the transcript's available.
Thank you so much, Pastor Phil, and you have a wonderful week.
Thanks so much.
Look forward to Sunday morning.
Sounds great.
Okay, bye-bye.